So, my name is Miguel Madero. I'm a lead engineer at Practice Fusion. I have been working on client-side applications for a while, over 9 years or so. I was doing a lot of Windows Forms and WPF. I even did some Silverlight and Flex a while ago when that thing was still a thing. And a lot of the patterns that we were using there were really similar to what we are using today in Ember. Today at Practice Fusion, our core application is completely based in Ember. We have about 70 engineers developing just this product. We have a few other products, but we have around 70 engineers developing this. We have 8 different teams working on 14 different subdomains. And it's a lot of fun to work every day, except weekends. But the reason I mentioned this about Practice Fusion is because a lot of what I will be showing you today is stuff that we're actually doing on a day-to-day at work, and some of the components that we are using there. So just a small disclaimer, some of these things are not demo quality code. This is actual production code. I won't be showing a lot of code, but a lot of the concepts there. 30 components in 30 minutes. I'll have to apologize for the title that I published. I think that was a stupid idea. I was thinking of like covering 30 and like I will rush it. Who's keeping time? See if I will manage to show. I'll definitely show you a lot of components. I'm not sure if I'll do 30. If you guys are keeping time and count, then I'll buy you a bit afterwards if I don't meet my 30 components. But let's say we will see some components in 30 minutes, or maybe I'll run over time and we'll do a bit more than that. So what do you think when you hear components? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? What do you think of components? Web components? What? Reusable elements, yeah. What else we have there? Self-contained. Isolation and encapsulation, yeah, that's a good one. The other ones were good as well, but I like that one, and I think encapsulation and isolation is probably the key attribute when we think of components. I had a lot of arguments in the past, either in GitHub or internally working in projects where people were saying, well, but what's the point of doing this thing if it's not reusable? Well, it doesn't matter if it's not reusable. The main point of components is having some encapsulation. And we will talk a lot more about that. Obviously, composition is an important aspect as well. We could think of components to create controls and widgets, but that's only one part of what components are used for. If you think of single selects and your text boxes, and that's only one type of components, and we will cover other types of components as well. Obviously, web components is a big part, and hopefully at some time we'll get closer to that dream of web components. It's also something that it's sometimes easier to just write a component than to think of controllers and routes, and sometimes we just get too lazy and we just do that. Reuse, I just intentionally put it at the bottom because we often think of reuse as the main thing when it's important, but it's not the case. So let's just think of encapsulation. You have all this complex chemistry inside of your component, but at the end of the day, you just have this single interface of, say, in this case, a pill that you will swallow. We also think of the components as your rubbish bin. You will put everything dirty inside and just close the lid. And I think that's a metaphor that I stole from Tom Dale. All right, so who has written Ember components? Yeah, almost everyone. Cool. So I had this Hello World demo that I will just skip because I don't know how I'll do with time. It's already 5 minutes and I haven't shown you a single component, so I don't know if I'll do it with 30. Anyway. Just briefly, I know you guys have written components, but this is just like a quick recap. It all starts at the router with Ember. It's all driven by the URL. We all know that. The router eventually maps to different routes. Once you transition to a route, that guy takes over. It will set up the controller. It will also do some stuff with the model. Let's skip that. Sets up the controller. And eventually, in the controller, it will set some state to your components. The component will keep observing properties of your controller or whatever the context of that component happens to be. And then the component will send actions either to the route or the controller or whoever that outer context happens to be. I like to think of the model as something that is crossing all of the different roles in Ember. Similarly, services and other utils will be like cross-cutting concerns. At some point, we won't have controllers. So this is just like a sneak peek of something that will change on Ember 2.0. So components will just replace this thing that we had on the left. So with that, a quick note on Ember 2.0. A lot is changing. But you don't have to worry. Just use components today, and you will be fine. The migration path there will be easier if you start using more components. And there are a lot of interesting conversations happening on GitHub. And if you want to know more about what's going on Ember 2.0, I'll highly recommend you to look for the road to Ember 2.0 and have a look at the different Ember RFCs. They're really interesting. So a lot is happening on 2.0. A lot of that is around components. So as I mentioned, widgets is one of the different types of components, and it's often the one that we think more when we are thinking components. I'll show you some examples of widgets. We also have domain-specific components. I'll show you some of these. Once you're thinking of these widgets and domain-specific components, even though at the end of the day they're both components, implementation is the same. You still have your template and you have your JavaScript handling the behavior of this. Conceptually, it makes sense to make this distinction, and I'll go a bit deeper into that. We could think of widgets as these reusable pieces of, let's think of Lego pieces that you will be using all over your app again and again. And then you have like the typical Lego pieces, right? You have your yellow square that will go pretty much everywhere. And then you have your single red Lego piece. However, once you're building more complex Lego pieces like a space shuttle, we could think of the space shuttle as your app. You will have some domain-specific pieces that they don't really play anywhere else where you're using Lego pieces, but you might need a turbine or like this small piece of the shuttle or the engine of the space shuttle. Those will be domain-specific components. They are not as reusable, but then there are still other pieces that you will use to compose your application. So once you start thinking of types of components, think of what will be some of the benefits of those. Obviously, the main principle is the same, still encapsulation. One of the key benefits of widgets is reuse. So you want to be using all of these things across your app. You have a text box or a data grid, you want to use it all over the place. Secondary benefits will be composition. Once you're thinking domain components, separation of concerns and composition is one of the main benefits. Even if you're not thinking of reusing your domain-specific components, it will make sense to think of this separation of concerns. I'll show you some examples in a second. And obviously, reuse, sometimes you end up reusing these domain-specific components, and testability is a huge one, especially when you have distributed teams and you want them to be testing all of these components in isolation. So let's go with a quick demo. Who's sleeping? Oh. All right, so apologies for the resolution there. Let me see if I can do something about that. All right, so This is a component library that we built. These are the widgets of the app. These are the reusable components. These are our reusable square Lego pieces that we use all over the place. Instead of that one, we have things like an autocomplete, which will let you search by, we'll just do this type of autocomplete. In our component library, we always try to give some examples, and then we have the code and the actual implementation. We could play with them. We have things like button groups. Most of our input widgets have these 3 states. They could be, they're on the normal state, they could be disabled, or they could have errors. So we want to do all of these things consistently across our application. Then we have others that have colors. For example, when we show allergies inside of our product, we have the severity. Let's look at a few more interesting ones. So we need to display where pharmacies are inside of our product. And then we also need to give our patients the option to have directions from here is the pharmacy and here is your house. So our component is actually really simple. We just give it an address. And this we could just data bind to your model or your controller. And similarly with the destination. We have a data grid just because any app needs a table and a data grid. So this one gives us all of the nice features of like sorting and fixed headers and fixed columns, so we can scroll horizontally and vertically as well. In some areas of the product, we also have the option to show and hide some columns based either on user preferences, or they could toggle this. Let me see, and yeah, we also have some support for infinite scrolling, and we do some magic there just to make it more efficient, to avoid adding a lot of markup. So when thinking widgets, obviously reuse and consistency are one of the main components, or one of the main attributes of this. Also, we tend to do a lot of DOM manipulation, and we tend to do a lot of jQuery sometimes inside of those components. We try not to, but then sometimes that's exactly the main thing that they're doing, and that they're abstracting the rest of our code away from. Internally, they actually speak the language of the view. They subscribe to click events, and they create DOM elements, and they create an LI, or they instantiate a jQuery plugin. Externally, as you saw, I think the Google Maps example is a good one. They just have an address and a destination. We don't know anything about whether it's using Canvas or how it's downloading the images and the different sprites. So what about domains? And there is a bit of contrast between those two. This is one of the sections of our app. Can you guys have a wild guess at how many components are we using there? 30, maybe. That will be an easy way of putting a check in there. We're using roughly 11 components just on this section on the right that is visible, and that allows us to decouple a lot of these things. And once we are developing this, we are thinking of each panel at the same time. We could look at the medication list, and then we could develop that independently. We could give it its own fake data, have some unit tests for this, and then eventually injecting that into the rest of the app is just as simple as adding some markup to your, well, some handlebar expressions to your HBS files. And similarly, composing these components is really simple. So in this case, we have a toolbox that contains a component called template search, and inside of that one, we have these silly tabs, and then inside of the tabs, we have a frequent medications, which is another component. Then those components will interact with the rest of the world, and eventually when you select one medication from here, it appears over there. But again, testing the interactions between those two, testing the behavior of these two components can be done in isolation, and then we could have simpler tests just to test the integration of these components. So that's great. That gives us encapsulation. We also have composition. Separation of concerns is a bit more important when it comes to domain components. Let me show you another example. Now I'll switch back to the app. This was clearly not designed for this resolution. Let me close some panels here. Yeah. All right. Actually, funny thing. Never mind. So this area of the app, the encounter, that's where the doctor will be interacting with when the patient is in the room. He will usually be looking at things like vital signs, what's the chief complaint, then he needs to know about the diagnosis of the patient, and he looks at the allergies, or he could record allergies, and similarly for medications, he'll be recording medications. That's the data grid that I showed you earlier. And then you go down this list, and you have things like the plan, and then eventually you have this other area, quality of care, and then you have referrals, like which other doctors are looking at this patient or who refer you to this patient, and then super bill, which has to do with billing, and now it kind of makes sense for the user to look at all of these things in the same area, similar to how you go to Amazon and then you look at your shipping address and your previous orders in the same place, just because it makes sense for Amazon to give you this summary. However, as I mentioned earlier, we actually develop these things in separate teams. Everyone has their own areas and their own spaces. So components is a really easy way for us to integrate areas of essentially components that are developed by other engineers in other teams. So the super bill is coming from the billing module, and then referrals is coming from collab, and then medications and other parts are coming from clinical. Even those things that are coming from clinical, like medications, allergies, it makes sense for them to be separate, because even though they are in the same module, they are still involving different concerns. So with domain components, we actually try to avoid DOM manipulation. I feel that we build enough widgets to be able to completely avoid DOM manipulation. And then once we are developing a medications component, we only focus on how do we get medications, how do we sort medications, how do we interact with other services to do things around medications. So that's something we don't want to deal with. Internally, we avoid using the view language. We don't think of, even though they are components and they technically have access to the markup, we like not to speak the language of the view. We don't think about clicks. We actually think about selections, because we use these high-level widgets. And externally, we are always using the domain of the language, the language of that particular domain. Like we are discontinuing a medication as opposed to they click something. So in order to be able to truly achieve this separation, and I think this has been a controversial subject, there have been a few discussions about whether components should be doing their own data access, or whether all the data access should be done in the router or in the routes, or some people do it even in the controllers. What's your take on that? What do you guys think? You probably already know what I think, but a bit of both, maybe. So for us, it kind of makes sense to make a strong separation between. I mean, if it's a widget, it probably makes less sense for that to have their own data access. If it's a domain-specific component, it usually makes more sense for them to have to be responsible, not exactly of knowing how to get their data, but at least they know who to ask for their data. So they might not get their data directly, but they might go through Ember data. They might use other services that those services know how to get the data, whether it's cache or they actually need to go to the backend and get this data. We don't give access to the components don't have access to the controller, so that's one of those. They could interact with either services or Ember data, but not with controllers. But at the end of the day, it actually makes more sense for them to think, for example, in the case of billing. If we look at this application, at this area of the app, all of that page, we go to the encounter route. It renders the encounter controller. And then all of those things, at some point, actually a few months ago, all of that thing was inside of encounter HBS. It was a single handlebars template that was doing everything crossing domains. And then the encounter route was actually responsible for getting a lot of the data for all of these different parts of the UI. They were not different components at the time. So one thing is rendering, right? You could say, yeah, all of the super build stuff is rendered by a component, but then if the route is still getting the data for the super build, then it's the same violation of responsibilities and the same crossing of domains. So at least in our case, it made a lot of sense to have components knowing how to get their data or who to ask for their data. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we do something.
Yeah, cool. So a quick summary on that difference. So widgets, usually the data is provided to those widgets. Some exceptions might actually be an autocomplete. It might make sense for that one to know how to get more data as you're filtering. Widgets, they do their own DOP manipulation. We avoid that in domain components. And then for domain components, when it comes to data access, they often just get GUIDs instead of getting their models directly. Cool. How are we doing on time? Yeah, any questions so far on the difference between widgets and components? Yeah. That's a great question. We use just a tiny bit of animation, and it's usually handled by the widgets directly. We have some jQuery. We got rid recently of some jQuery UI. We use some CSS transitions, and I have not done a lot of that myself, but I know we have it in different areas of the product. Yeah. Yeah. But we don't have a lot of that. It's just most of that is just rendering data and collecting data. We have some subtle animations here and there. Like some panels are sliding in and sliding out as you close them, but that's minor things. And then often it's just the widget that is doing that for us. Yeah, that's a good question. So oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, what do we do with the CSS? How do we manage that? So the answer is, right now, I think we're actually doing a poor job at that. Often we have one big file, usually per vertical, and sometimes some domains, they break that file into different smaller files. But it gets a bit messy. We are moving away. We are actually redoing our CSS style guide, and we have the goal of not having any CSS. We have the goal of not writing any CSS inside of the app, and all of that will be written in our domain library, in our component library. And all of these widgets will have their own CSS, and we'll just be using classes that are already defined there. I don't think we're ever going to get there, but I think that's a good goal to strive there. The product is kind of big already, and I don't think we're going to get to the point where we will completely get rid of the existing one. And then there are cases where we might have exceptions, and we have some custom CSS, but we are trying to avoid that as much as possible. And then also something else that is helping us a lot, we are using, how's it called? Can't remember if it's a SMAX or BEM. I always get these two mixed. But essentially, we are using the same name of the component as the name of our class. So if we have a medication detail, or if we have a detail pane, which is one of the widgets, we have a detail pane. And if that one has subcomponents, let's say the detail pane that I showed earlier, it has a toolbox. Then it will be detail pane -- toolbox. So all of those are scoped to that particular component. And then we have that one-to-one between Ember Components and BEM or SMAX components in CSS. And then we see that also reflected in the file structure. So you open the components folder, and then you will have the same structure that the handlebars templates are. Yep.
Just an extension of that question. So.
Oh, yeah. The question is whether they are siblings or they live on similar structures. We are mirroring the structure, but they are on different subfolders. Okay. Yeah. Yep. That's an excellent question. Right now we have a single repository, and we have everything separated inside of the same repo. Let me show you here. So inside of the same repo, we have all of these different domains. Sorry, it's hard to read, but we have things like ACO, billing, clinical, collaboration, electronic prescriptions, labs, etc. So they're all they're on separate files. They are all actually compiled independently. And right now, so we have been debating this, whether we should split them on separate repos or not. Some of these modules will eventually, at some point, create them as separate repos. Some of the changes that are coming on Ember 2.0 have to do with engines. So we are sort of waiting a bit to see what happens with engines before we do a move from what we currently have. The other part that we actually split is our boot time was really slow. So we actually split all of everything that had to do with login. Our users cannot do anything with the app until they enter their credentials. So for different apps, they might not have that luxury. But for us, it was actually really easy to just do everything that's required for login, including like remember I forgot my password and things like that. And that's actually distributed to the clients first. So we went from like 6.5 megabytes to sending them only 500 kilobytes after everything is gzipped. And that's including Ember and a few other core libraries. And then everything else is downloaded in the background. And then we define all of the routes, only the routes that are necessary for booting the app. And then once we load all of the other modules, then we load all of the other routes. And then we had to do some synchronization there because sometimes they might be able to log in, especially if they have a password reminder, or they might be able to log in before the whole app has been downloaded. So we just needed to abort the transition, and once they are done, then we continue the transition to the other route. Hopefully, engines will take care of some of that. We thought about splitting that further and then say now if the first transition is to labs, only load labs. But we don't really know until sometimes we don't know until they log in, because depending on their role, we might send them to one place or another. And it was too much work to keep splitting it apart. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the questions about widgets.
So let me quickly go up like a few slides. All right, so sorry, I had a better diagram that I removed from this presentation. So with composite components, it actually gets a bit trickier because this guy might actually send it to another component, and then that sends it to another component, that sends it to another component. Often what we found is that you need one layer, or one layer is often fine. The other thing is that if we have this model, this shared model, that's actually the glue that is putting the rest of the things together. So we could think of this as the component will be changing the state of the model, and then another component, whether it's nested or separate, or it might be a sibling, that other component might be actually interested in the same data. So in the example that I showed before, where we have the medication list, we add medications to the plan, and then they appear on this other component just because they are both listening to, they're both rendering the same array of medications, or they both know about the same array of medications. So that reduces a lot of the communication up. So yeah, normally we'll call the store and find those records instead of passing those records down. In a lot of what we are doing, we are not using Ember data. In case where we are using Ember data, then yeah, that will work. And then if Ember data already cached that record, that means it's not going to go to the backend and fetch that record again. The problem is when you actually have a query, and then unless things have changed, Ember data wouldn't cache your query. It will always go to the backend and try to get it. In what we have, we actually have a layer in between, whether it's Ember data or IC Ajax, and we are caching at that layer. So if let's say if we loaded all of the medications for a patient, we know we have them there, and then every component will request those, and then we'll just give them straight from the cache. So yeah. I think having that layer in between, whether it's Ember data or something else, it makes sense. Once you're doing this, it's more important just to make sure that you are not loading data more than you are not doing unnecessary server requests. I don't know why I switched back to PowerPoint. I normally use Keynote. But yeah, that's all I have. I actually had a few things, but I think that will take me still a bit more time. Some interesting resources, the road to Ember 2.0. There are some interesting things happening with components in Ember 2.0. I think we could have gone a full presentation just on what's changing. But certainly check that out, that's pretty cool. Also, we have a GitHub for Practice Fusion. A lot of what I showed today, I'm being recorded, right? Might, at some point in the future, I'm not making any promises, be open source and release over there. And if it's not there, it will be on my repo. But we are certainly releasing a lot of the widgets, especially the widgets, only the domain-specific components. It doesn't make sense for anyone, but our stuff the widgets, a lot of them will be releasing as open source. And a few other things to check if you're building components and you're planning on doing them or releasing widgets, Ember CLI add-ons, that's a good way of doing them. And check also the Ember RFCs. Yeah. That's all I got. Thank you very much.